Gloria walked into the room and froze in shock. Her husband, Patrick, was sexually harassing their 2-year-old daughter. She had stepped out to buy what he sent her but had forgotten the money on the table and returned to retrieve it. That was when she heard the piercing cries of her child echoing through the house. Alarmed, she ran to the room where the cries came from and found Patrick doing the unthinkable. "What are you doing, Patrick?" she shouted, horrified. Without waiting for an answer, she rushed forward, scooping her trembling daughter into her arms and holding her close to her chest. "What are you doing, Patrick?" she asked again, her voice shaking, but he said nothing. "You know, people have told me things about you, Patrick, but I never believed them," she continued, her voice rising with anger and despair. "I thought, no, you wouldn't hurt a child. You wouldn't even touch me. I am here if you wanted sex, so why? Why our own daughter? Oh, my God." Patrick finally began to plead, his words stumbling out, but Gloria wasn't listening. She walked out of the room, holding her daughter in her arms, and headed straight to the hospital. That evening, she returned home alone. In silence, she cooked Patrick's favorite meal, a pot of delicious jollof rice, and served it to him. Patrick was relieved and thought her actions meant forgiveness. After all, Gloria loved him deeply and would never let anything, not even their child, come between them. But as Patrick finished eating, his body slumped to the floor, lifeless. Gloria had poisoned the meal. She left to the hospital early the next morning. She fled with her daughter from the hospital, leaving the town and heading for the city to start a new life. Mary and her mother, along with her siblings, had just moved to the United States to reunite with their father after years of living apart. The family was excited to start a new chapter in their lives, and Mary, eager to continue her education, enrolled in a local university. It wasn't long before she met David, a young man in her class who was charming, intelligent, and easy to talk to. They quickly became friends, sharing classes, laughter, and long conversations. As time passed, their friendship blossomed into something deeper. They fell in love and began dating. One evening, as they sat in a quiet park, David opened up to Mary about something very important. He told her that he wasn't just an ordinary student, but the crown prince of his village back home. His father was the king, and one day, David would take his place. He also explained that in his culture, a prince's wife must be a virgin. David looked at Mary, his heart full of hope, and asked if she could be that special person for him. Mary listened carefully, her heart racing. With a smile, she told David that she was indeed a virgin and had never been with any other man. She had always dreamed of finding someone she truly loved, and now she had found that person in him. David was overjoyed, and they both knew that their bond was something truly special. After graduating from university, David proposed to Mary in the most beautiful way, and she gladly accepted. They began making plans for the next big step in their lives. Together, they traveled back to David's village for a grand ceremony, where David would be crowned as the new king, and they would also marry. It was the beginning of an exciting new chapter for both of them, filled with love and a future they would build together. Few days after their arrival, the coronation was staged with the chief priest heading it. I was full of joy today. It was the coronation of our beloved son, Prince David, but as tradition demands, a king must have a queen before he can wear the crown. Thankfully, he had chosen a woman worthy of him and the throne. The gods have smiled on us, announced a priest of Ekugu village, addressing the crowd. Our prince has brought home a queen fit for his crown. Let the ceremony begin. The crowd erupted with cheers, shouting, I see. Now, daughter, step forward and walk on the sacred mat to meet your husband, the priest commanded. Mary stood, her face glowing with pride, and stepped toward the sacred mat. But the moment her foot touched it, she let out a loud, piercing scream and collapsed to the ground. The crowd froze in shock. Gasps and murmurs filled the air. Prince David darted forward, desperate to reach Mary. But the priest stopped him with a stern hand. "Do not touch her," the priest thundered. "She's cursed, a woman of doom, an abomination to the gods." The guards quickly grabbed Mary as chaos erupted. "Take her to Neen," the priest ordered. "If she survives, it will be the gods' will." Prince David struggled to follow, but his mother and the elders held him back. Meanwhile, Mary's mother ran after her daughter, tears streaming down her face, crying her name. The priest turned to Prince David. "Choose another maiden if you wish to proceed with your coronation. Otherwise, we must wait until the gods choose another time." David's face was pale with confusion and anguish. Without a word, he turned and walked away, his mind spinning with questions he could not answer. Queen Nkechi followed her son, her face clouded with worry. "David," she called, her voice firm yet gentle. "You told me she was a virgin. Did you? Did you two have any kind of intimacy?" She looked straight into his eyes, searching for the truth. "What? Mother, no!" David exclaimed, clearly offended. "We've kissed, yes, but I have never touched her beyond that. You know I respect our traditions. I would never break them." He paused, his voice trembling. "But now I'm scared. Could this mean the gods have rejected our union? Or are they mistaken? What's happening, Mother?" Queen Nkechi sighed heavily, but before she could answer, a sharp voice cut through the tension. "There's only one explanation," Princess Neka interjected, stepping into the room with a knowing look. David turned to her, his face darkening. "And what's that?" "She lied to us," Neka said, her voice dripping with accusation. "She lied to everyone. Mary isn't who she claims to be." "Stop it!" David snapped, glaring at his sister. "You have no proof. Don't speak ill of her." But Neka pressed on, her words relentless. "You heard what the priest said. The gods don't make mistakes. Anyways, you have a bride prepared down for you for issues like this. I don't know why you do not want Mary Chenier." Frustrated, David stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. By evening, the news had spread like wildfire through the village. Whispers and accusations filled the air. Everyone knew the truth, or what they believed was the truth. In their tradition, a woman who falls or dies during the sacred ceremony is no longer a virgin, and only virgins could marry the crown prince. At Neen's hut, Mary finally opened her eyes the next morning. Her vision was blurry, but she saw her mother sitting beside her, crying softly. "Mom, what happened?" Mary whispered weakly. Her mother gasped in relief. "Oh, thank God, my daughter is alive." She quickly helped Mary sit up, wiping her tears. "We must leave for the city immediately," her mother said urgently. Mary frowned, confused. "Leave? What about David? Where is he?" Her mother's sobs grew louder. "Don't ask questions. We need to go now." But Mary shook her head, her strength returning. "I need to see David first," she said firmly. Before her mother could stop her, Mary got up and ran toward the palace. When she arrived, the guards wouldn't let her in. She stood outside, shouting David's name, her voice cracking. But David never came out. Instead, a group of maids appeared, carrying her belongings. Mary's heart sank. "What's going on? Where is David?" she cried. The maids said nothing and left her there. Villagers passing by began to notice her. At first, they whispered, but soon their voices grew louder. "She's cursed," one shouted. "You tried to ruin our prince," another yelled. Someone threw a fruit, and others joined in, mocking her. Mary's phone buzzed suddenly, and she grabbed it quickly. It was David. "David!" she cried into the phone, but his voice was distant and cold. "I'm sorry, Mary. I can't see you right now. Go with your mother and return home." "David, please," she pleaded, but he hung up. When she tried to call him back, her calls were blocked. Her tears flowed freely as she turned to her mother, who was still begging her to leave. This time, Mary had no choice. She followed her mother home, crying bitterly, her heart broken into pieces. When Mary arrived in the city, her mind was a whirlwind of confusion. She kept replaying the events of the ceremony. But David told me the mat only rejects those who aren't virgins. She muttered to herself, "Why did it reject me? I've never been with a man." Her thoughts raced. Was it because I kissed David the night before the ceremony? Could that have been enough to anger the gods? Oh no! I should have waited. She buried her face in her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. David wouldn't even answer her calls, and that hurt her the most. Her mother and father did everything they could to comfort her, but nothing worked. Mary cried bitterly, unable to understand why the sacred mat had rejected her. Meanwhile, back in the village, David's mother and elders pressed him to marry Shinier, the maiden whom have been kept for the prince since childhood, or he should choose another maiden. The throne cannot remain empty, David, his mother said firmly. You must do what is best for our kingdom. But David couldn't bring himself to choose anyone else. His heart belonged to Mary, no matter what had happened. He loved her deeply and couldn't imagine being with another woman. Frustrated and torn, David made a decision. He would confront Mary. He needed answers. Why would she hide something so important from me, knowing our traditions? He thought. His resolve hardened. He would see her and demand the truth. A few weeks later, Mary was still asleep when there was a knock at the door. Her mother went to answer it and was surprised to see David standing there. "David, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice filled with both anger and concern. "You need to leave. Mary has just started recovering, and I won't let her go back to the state she was in." Mary's mother frowned deeply, then added, "Why didn't you let her know about your traditions before disgracing her? In front of the whole village?" David sighed and shook his head. "I did tell her. From the moment I decided to marry her. I told Mary that I'm a prince and that our tradition demands every crown prince must marry a virgin. She never told me she wasn't. That's why I'm here to find out why. Why did she hide this from me? Did she think I was joking?" Mary's mother froze, her face pale with shock. "What? But who still follows such traditions in this modern age? How can that even matter now?" She started pacing back and forth, her hands shaking. Then she stopped and pointed toward the door. "You should leave immediately, David. Since you now know my daughter isn't a virgin and can't marry you, just stay away from her." But David stood firm. "I'm not leaving. I need to see Mary and hear the truth from her. Do you think I'm not in pain too? Do you know how people are mocking me, pointing fingers at me? I've lost my honor." As Mary's mother continued trying to push him away, Mary walked into the room, rubbing her eyes. "What's going on here, mother?" she asked, her voice groggy. She stopped in her tracks when she saw David. "David? Oh my God!" She gasped and ran toward him, throwing her arms around him. But David didn't return the hug. His face was cold, and his voice was firm. "We need to talk," he said sharply. Mary stepped back, confused and hurt. "Okay, come into my room and we can talk," she said softly. Without another word, David followed her into the room, his face unreadable. David looked at Mary, his voice firm but full of confusion. "Why did you lie to me, Mary? You knew what my tradition demands. Why would you keep such a secret from me?" Mary's eyes widened as she shook her head. "David, I didn't lie to you. I've never known any man. You're my first boyfriend and the only one I've ever had. I don't understand why this is happening," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. David stared at her, his mind racing. He didn't know what to believe anymore. "Could it be because you're not from my village?" he asked, a curious look on his face. Mary shrugged helplessly. "I don't know," she whispered. David sighed deeply, running his hand through his hair. "Maybe I need to visit the priest and ask him why this happened. There must be an explanation. I must reach the end of this," he said, trying to sound confident. "I don't see myself marrying someone else, Mary. I love you." Then he pulled Mary into a gentle hug before leaving. As soon as David left, Mary's mother rushed to her side. "Mary," she said anxiously, "have you both officially broken up?" Mary, to her mother's surprise, looked happy. She shook her head, smiling slightly. "No, Mother. He said he's going to find out what went wrong." But her mother's face darkened with worry. She didn't want David to marry her daughter anymore. Knowing the strict tradition, she feared that even if they found a way, their union would never be fully accepted. When David got home, he went straight to the priest to ask for answers. The priest looked at him seriously and said, "The sacred mat only rejects someone who is not a virgin. If it rejected her, then it means she's not one. But there's more you need to find out. Ask Mary to talk to her mother. She must ask her why she always has the nightmares she always has." Confused but determined, David returned to Mary and told her what the priest had said. At first, Mary was silent, but then a chill ran through her as memories of her recurring nightmare came flooding back. "David," she said, her voice shaking, "there's a nightmare I've had for years. In the dream, a young man comes to me, and he forces himself on me. Then my mother appears and shoots him from behind. The man falls on me dead, and I'm soaked in his blood." Tears welled up in her eyes as she continued. "This nightmare kept coming back, over and over, and it always so real. That's why I've always been so careful about making friends. I even told my mother about it, but she just prayed for me and said it was just a bad dream that would never come true." Mary paused, her voice now filled with urgency. "But now I need to seriously ask her about it. There must be something she hasn't told me." David nodded, his face grim. "Yes, you need to talk to her. We need to know the truth." David wanted to follow her, but Mary asked him not to. "I need to talk to her alone," she said firmly. When Mary got home, she confronted her mother directly. "Is there something you're not telling me?" she asked, her voice filled with confusion and frustration. Her mother hesitated, pacing nervously before finally speaking. "Mary, your real father, there was something terrible about his behavior that I kept from you all these years," she said, her voice breaking. What are you talking about?" Mary asked, her heart pounding. "What do you mean by real father?" Her mother took a deep breath. "Your father was a pedophile. There were things he did, things I could never forgive. When I discovered the truth, I couldn't bear it. I made a choice to protect you, and that's why he is no longer here." Mary froze, trying to process her mother's words. "What do you mean? Are you saying you—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Yes, Mr. Chucks is not your biological father. Your father was the one who defiled you at 2," her mother said, tears falling. "It was so much pain for me to bear. I couldn't let him hurt you or anyone else ever again." Mary sank into a chair, her mind racing. "Why didn't you tell me before?" she whispered. "I wanted to shield you from the pain. I prayed it would never come to this," her mother said, holding Mary tightly as she began to cry. "So where is he?" Mary asked her mother, but her mother told her she had poisoned him and he died. Mary locked herself in her room for days, refusing to come out. Her cries echoed through the house as she struggled to figure out how to explain the situation to David. He called her several times, but she wouldn't answer. Frustrated and worried, David decided to visit Mary's house. However, when he arrived, Mary's mother didn't allow him in. That day, Mr. Chucks, Mary's stepfather, was at home. After David left, he asked Mary's mother why she had refused to let the young man see his fiancée, and why Mary had locked herself in her room. With a heavy heart, Mary's mother confided in him, revealing everything. Mr. Chucks was deeply saddened by Mary's ordeal and suggested that Mary return to the United States to stay with her siblings. Perhaps being with her brother and sister will help her heal and forget about everything, he said. Mary's mother agreed it was a good idea, but Mary refused to open the door to anyone. Desperate, her mother called Mr. Chucks to see if he could convince Mary to come out. Mr. Chucks had another idea. tell David the truth," he said firmly. "If he truly loves her, he'll fight for her. If not, then Mary should return to the US to rebuild her life." Mary's mother hesitated but eventually agreed. She invited David over, with Mr. Chuck's support, and sat him down. She told him about everything. David looked at them both, his jaw tight. "I love Mary," he said after a moment. "This doesn't change that. But I need to talk to her." Mary's mother nodded and called out gently, "Mary, please come out. David is here, and he wants to talk to you." The room fell silent. After a long pause, the door opened slowly, and Mary stepped out, her face pale but determined. David stood up immediately and moved toward her. "Mary," he said softly, "I'm here, and I understand everything." Mary, still processing everything, finally talks to David. She explains the nightmares she's had for years, which she now understands are connected to her past. David listens carefully and assures her that despite everything, his feelings for her haven't changed. He tells her he understands and wants to support her as he could. They discuss how this has affected their relationship and the challenges ahead. But David insists he's ready to face them with her. Mary, though still uncertain, starts to feel some relief as David promises to stand by her. David spoke to his mother and the elders, telling them he wanted to step aside from becoming king, so his younger brother could take over. He wanted to marry the woman he loved instead, but they didn't agree with his decision. His mother begged him to think about all the effort his father had put into building the kingdom. David replied that the tradition of kings marrying only virgins was made by someone long ago, and since a king's word is law, he had the right to change it. However, they told him that only a crowned king could make new laws, and since he hadn't been crowned yet, he couldn't change anything. This left David feeling confused and frustrated. One day, while deep in thought, David went to his father's grave. He remembered his father's wise words, "Men are the gods. Whatever you choose to be, the gods will follow, but only if you can pay the price." David had always asked his father what the price was, but his father never answered. That evening, David went to the priest and asked what price he had to pay to make his own choice. The priest warned him that going against tradition was an abomination. He said if David did so, neither he nor his descendants would ever rule the kingdom again. Even though he was afraid, David chose to marry Mary. Soon after, he was crowned king, knowing the heavy price he might have to pay for his decision. A few years later, Mary still couldn't conceive, and she became very worried. Seeing her distress, David told her that her condition was the price he had to pay for them to be together. He said it was the will of the gods. But Mary refused to accept that and sought help from God through a man of God. She and David began praying with the pastor. One night, while David was sleeping, his father appeared to him in a dream. His father told him, "The price is the heart. Whatever you believe in and work towards with your heart can change everything." When David woke up, he shared the dream with the pastor. The pastor introduced him to the Lord Jesus Christ, and David accepted him. Both David and Mary gave their lives to Christ and started worshiping God instead of their gods. A few years later, Mary became pregnant and gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. News of their story spread throughout Akugu village, and many people turned to Christ. David and his household continued to serve God, though they lost everything they had gained from their gods. God blessed their home abundantly, and they found peace and joy in serving Him.